If you're anything like me, the current pre-Phase 4 really kicking in energy of the MCU brings with it a mix of love and nostalgia for the last decade or so, alongside nervous excitement on where we go from here. Will the new cast live up to the old? Can anything top literally watching a cinematic universe come together and pay off across a whole decade? Will Frog Thor ever get out of that jar in Loki's 5th episode? Questions, questions, questions. But if there's one thing Marvel fans always have a blast dissecting, it's answers to those questions. Of all the positive, celebratory vibes that came from closing out Endgame in 2019 then, there was one notable talking point about its time-traveling plot that not even the creators themselves could explain. To break this down, let's first quickly recap the events of Endgame, and what led to such a gaping plot hole in the first place. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and this is how Loki fixes Avengers Endgame's biggest plot hole. Also, full spoilers for both Endgame and the whole season of Loki. So in a supremely ballsy move from one of the MCU's most confident filmic duos, Anthony and Joe Russo essentially invented or at least spotlighted a new genre for Endgame, the time heist. Building an entire movie around the idea of our heroes traveling back through time to find enough Infinity Stones from different points in the MCU's past, it worked incredibly on a meta-narrative level too, letting those who'd been along for the ride take a sizable trip down memory lane. The rules were established that taking an Infinity Stone out of time to use it in the present is allowed if you then make a point of returning it. The reason given from Tilda Swinton's The Ancient One was that Earth needs these stones to defend against the forces of darkness that could manifest, and they simply can't be removed altogether. Come the close of the film, Thanos is defeated, and Captain America's last mission, with the help of some Pym particles, is to return the stones, re-solidify the timeline, and emerge back in the present. We watch Cap disappear through the time machine, and next we see him, a good 60 to 70 years have passed off screen, leaving Steve, a notably older man, now sitting peacefully on a park bench. His 100-plus-year-old age isn't too big a problem, we can chalk that up to the super soldier serum after all, but the question of how Cap got back to that bench in the first place appeared to break everything. So let's break down the plot hole itself, as there have been two major theories as to how Cap arrived on that bench. Number 1, multiverse theory. Cap travelled back to the 1940s, returned the last Infinity Stone back to where it belongs, and began living a life with Peggy. Because he's altering Peggy's past, this fractures time and creates a separate reality where the pair can live out their lives together, maybe saving Bucky in the process and preventing the deaths of Howard and Maria Stark. Honestly, anything could go. It's a full-on what-if that we never see. Cap being on that bench comes from him using a remaining file of Pym particles that he first took from the SHIELD base in 1970 to beam back at the exact time he knew he was supposed to return in the first place. There's a whole wing of MCU fandom that thinks this has to be the way things go, because there's no way good-hearted Steve Rogers wouldn't interfere with the atrocities of our own history whenever he could. Cap literally states in Civil War that he wishes he could leave some things be, but immediately he takes that back, as he fundamentally enjoys doing the right thing. Number 2, the one timeline theory. This revolves around Cap setting all the stones back in place across the main MCU timeline, consisting of everything we've watched as an audience that is referred to in Loki as the sacred timeline, settling into his life with Peggy in the background of all those other movies. It means that between the 1940s and 2011, there are 2 Captain Americas on Earth, one in the ice and another away from the spotlight living his best life. The problem is it clashes with an interpretation of the rules of Endgame, that you can't change the past, which I'll get back to. On the positive side though, this theory lines up with the Agent Carter TV show, which always left Peggy's husband as a mystery, as it could have been Cap trying to hide his identity all along. Hilariously, even the writers and directors of Endgame couldn't agree on any of this. Directors Anthony and Joe Russo clashed with their own writers, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, on what the hell they'd actually filmed. Marcus noted in 2019 that because Rogers is replacing the Lost Stone, Steve going back and just being there would not create a new timeline. The Ancient One specifically states that when you take an Infinity Stone out of a timeline, it creates a new timeline, so I reject the Steve is in an alternate reality theory. On the opposite side were the Russos, countering that every decision you made in the past could potentially create a new timeline. The old Cap at the end, he lived his married life in a different universe from the main one. He had to make another jump back to the main universe at the end to give the shield to Sam. Their debate very much mirrored what was being argued out amongst fans, and though Endgame was a staggering achievement in filmmaking and expert franchise planning, this final plot hole is a constant loose thread. All of this brings us onto Loki, and the MCU now having a show that dives headfirst into all things timeline related, alongside the psychological and philosophical ramifications of whether you could trust an infinite number of yourself to do the right thing. Though the show is very much about Loki, Loki variants, and eventually He Who Remains / Kang the Conqueror, it does retroactively solidify one of the theories I mentioned before. Turns out the solution all along was the one timeline explanation. Why? Because following Loki's finale, Kang spells out that the one thing the TVA was created to stop is multiple realities. He explains there was an all-out multiversal war that spawned the creature Alioth. Establishing the TVA stopped the butchery between realms and tamed the beast, with the Time Variance Authority's purpose coming down to eliminating any variant that would emerge from a different or fractured timeline. Judge Renslayer notes in episode 1 that everything the Avengers did was supposed to happen, and we can only then conclude that the TVA would have actively kidnapped and pruned a variant Steve Rogers. Conversely, they can let a single Captain America go back through one timeline, the sacred timeline, replace the stones and live out his life with Peggy before eventually emerging as an old man on that park bench, alongside Bucky and Falcon. I'll get back to the why in a second, but the first key takeaway from all this is noting when the Time Variance Authority take action. Now, obviously in the real world, many of Marvel's creators have had plenty time to get their heads together and clarify what was really going on when crafting 6 episodes of Loki, but this TVA explanation retroactively makes all of Endgame make much more sense. In conclusion, the problem many people had with a Captain America just sitting around between the 1940s and now isn't really the case, and honestly never was. After Cap places the stones back in their right places and shares that kiss with Peggy, he's no longer Captain America. He's Steve Rogers, a soldier who finally managed to actually live a life, find love, and do everything the whole rest of his existence was ignoring. Steve hates bullies. It's why he signed up to take on the biggest bullies of all time in the 40s, and this Rogers knows that in the end, the most chaotic tyrant in the cosmos will always be taken care of, placing him back in the past and freeing up his responsibilities. I mentioned before how Agent Carter kept Peggy's partner a mystery. Well, writers Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely added fuel to this notion of Steve gracefully growing old when discussing Civil War. Following fans pointing to an old man carrying the back of Peggy Carter's casket in the 2016 movie, Marcus noted at Comic-Con that Stephen and I are just so taken with the idea that Steve went back and got to live his life. To bring Endgame's rules back in again, there's enough here to say that the movie does allow for this, alongside what we've learned in Loki. Bruce explains that the past becomes your future, i.e. Cap's life always led him back in time as we perceive it, but this is the way things always had to go. After the ice, after everything that happened in the 2010s, one day Steve is in 2023, the next it's the 1940s. That is how Steve Rogers / Captain America's life always played out, we and he just hadn't seen it yet. To bring even more wider context and canon from Loki in, it's clear that a Cap constantly on the run from the TVA, who accidentally stumbled onto the fact that all time as we know it is only part of an infinite number of realities, didn't happen. Chances are he'd tell someone in that 70-year gap, or he'd have something to say other than calmly passing the shield to Falcon on that fateful day outside Avengers HQ. Either way, Loki's new canon-expanding rule set regarding multiversal anomalies, variants, and timelines retroactively sews up Avengers Endgame's biggest plot hole. At least, that's what I think, having gone through all of Loki and thinking back to the mind-breaking script that was Avengers Endgame. Let me know your own thoughts down in the comments below, because maybe there's something I've missed that completely breaks this open again. For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com, and I'll catch you soon.